To continue, part two of a brief history of gun control in Canada. In 1878, alarmed by violent Orange Day rioting in Montreal that is blamed on Irish Canadians, the federal government reacts by eliminating an accused person's right to a trial by jury and orders the licensing of gun owners in proclaimed districts of Canada. The legislation is modeled on repressive statutes used against the Irish by the British government. Again, statutes, not laws. The whole point of statutes is to control behavior. A statute removes rights from individuals and places power and authority in the hands of the crown. Now, for those of you not old enough to realize or understand, Orange Day is the celebration of the victory of William of Orange, who became king, and yes, he is the signatory on the Bill of Rights of 1689. He's also known as King Billy. And Orange Day celebrations in Canada have always been interesting. Actually, one year, the person playing King Billy got struck by a rock and knocked off his horse in downtown Toronto as they paraded down Yonge Street. It was a big event. Now, carrying on. Known as the Blake Act, after its proponent, Liberal Justice Minister Edward Blake, the legislation is temporary in nature and is renewed annually by the federal government until 1883. During its brief existence, it is proclaimed in Montreal, Quebec City, and Winnipeg. Surprise, surprise. The federal government's first serious attempt at region-wide gun control occurs after the 1885 rebellion. Now, for those ignorant of Canadian history, this is the uprising that occurred in Manitoba, known as the Métis Rebellion, led by Louis Riel. Parliament bans Aboriginals, Métis, and disloyal white settlers in the Northwest Territories from possessing improved arms. Now see, again, everybody says it only, especially American anti-gun people, always say, well, the founding fathers only envisioned muskets. Well, here's a law here in Canada that is prohibiting the possession of firearms with rifled barrels and cartridge ammunition. The legislation allows them to possess only smoothbore firearms such as muzzle-loading muskets and shotguns. The government is well aware that the limited range of a smoothbore firearm provides only limited utility as weapons in modern military conflict. Yes, let's have, what's that, an assault weapons ban? Just as a note, my Lee Enfield 303 was carried into battle by both the British and Canadian armies in both World War I and II. That was the main battle rifle. It's a bolt-action rifle. Would we call that an assault rifle? No, we don't. We just call it a rifle. The legislation is passed on 20 July 1885. It is not coincidence that the bill is approved on the same day that Louis Riel stands trial for high treason. But afraid that disarming white settlers in the region would interfere with the protection of peaceable subjects and provoke another rebellion, that the authorities cannot afford to suppress the government. The government never proclaims it. In other words, the Governor General never signs it into law, but it did remain on the statute book until 1950. In 1892, provisions were introduced into the new criminal code requiring handgun owners to obtain a certificate of exemption from a justice of the peace if they wanted to carry a handgun on their person outside their home or place of business. However, anyone who had reasonable cause to fear an assault on their person or property did not require this exemption. Most Canadians have failed to appreciate that multiculturalism, a late 20th century construct, in fact a particularly virulent racism characterized politics and social science in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The foreign-born, particularly non-whites and immigrants from South and East Europe, are considered by Canada's Anglo-Saxon majority to be feeble-minded, prone to violent acquisitiveness, and criminal behavior. Along with the large numbers of immigrants who flood into Canada at the turn of the century, arrive unorthodox political philosophies such as socialism, anarchism, and communism that directly challenge the existing social and economic structure. Funny, today the biggest drum beaters for gun control and prohibition are the New Democratic Party, who, if you haven't figured out, are Canada's Socialist Party. Now, meanwhile, the Liberal Party kind of plays both sides of the fence. Marginalized by mainstream Canadian society, immigrants find themselves segregated into foreign settlements, basically ghettoized. The prevailing attitude towards the alien non-British immigrant that is described in the following newspaper articles is not atypical. In other words, it was very typical. Now, this is a direct quote out of the Edmonton Journal. Let not the sympathy of the tender-hearted be aroused by these poor chinks. They do not live like rats from force of circumstances. They prefer the stench and filth of their vile surroundings. They prefer the squalor because it is cheaper to live in filth than in cleanliness. Edmonton Journal, 1907. Now, again, from Lethbridge Herald, 1907, the Alberta government would be well advised if it passed legislation making it impossible for Japanese and Chinese to vote in this province. Make these yellow men realize that they are not going to have any influence on our affairs. It should be noted that it was these Chinese and Japanese that did a bulk of the work on the Trans-Canada Railway. Now, to continue on, the popular belief that aliens were genetically inferior, inherently criminal, and predisposed to radical, i.e. violent politics, is combined with an exaggerated perception of rising violent crime in Canada's foreign settlements. This anti-immigrant hysteria is used to justify handgun licensing and registration laws passed by Ontario in 1911. Manitoba and Saskatchewan in 1912, and British Columbia in 1913. Similar to the provincial statutes, the federal government's first serious handgun legislation requires that civilians obtain a police permit to acquire or to carry a handgun. It is introduced in June 1913, the same year that Canada records its highest level of immigration. Since the new law is administered by predominantly white Anglo-Saxon police officers, it is fairly self-evident that permits to carry were simply not an option open to resident aliens. The Western democracies, particularly the British Commonwealth, greet the Russian Revolution in 1917 and labor unrest following World War I with a flurry of gun control initiatives aimed at preventing the spread of Red Revolution. Britain introduces universal gun registration and owner licensing in what is viewed by most scholars as the first step in virtually eliminating their right to bear arms. Quick to follow suit, Canada. Following the 1919 Winnipeg general strike, the federal government responds to the establishment's fears of Bolshevik revolution, erroneously attributed to non-British alien scum. By prohibiting non-British immigrants from owning firearms and ammunition, the government is convinced that non-British immigrants, with their bad habits, notions, and vicious practices, are thorough-placed Bolsheviks, displaced or disciples of the torch and bomb, who show greater readiness to resort to the use of weapons than do our own people. And that came out of Hansard in 1919 at page 4,359 to 4,360, right out of the House of Parliament. Government's paranoia over a possible Bolshevik revolution peaks in 1920. The federal government orders the licensing of gun owners and the registration of rifles. In the government's view, shotguns, not used in times of trouble as the rifle is, and British subjects, remember that Canadians are British subjects until 1947, who own shotguns are exempt. Widespread opposition from firearms owners and rural MPs forces the government to repeal the legislation in 1921. 15,000 firearms owners march on Parliament Hill, and we're still saddled with Alan Rock's pet project. However, the requirement that aliens obtain a police-issued license to acquire and possess firearms is not repealed until the 1950s. National handgun registration is born in the context of the social and political upheavals of the Great Depression. It is passed on 3 July 1934. Having been rushed through Parliament in only 10 days, the law appears motivated by a fear of insurrection after Tim Buck, the popular leader of Canada's Communist Party, is released from prison in June 1934 and appears to the applause of tens of thousands at political rallies held in Montreal and Toronto. The federal government places handgun registration under authority of the RCMP. This is done not because the Mounties are more efficient than local police forces at processing applications. After all, they've been doing them all along, but because the RCMP is, according to Lorne and Caroline Brown's An Unauthorized History of the RCMP, the federal government's first line of defense against internal disorder and is considered the most reliable force in the country for breaking strikes, smashing the radical trade unions, controlling the unemployed, and hounding political dissenters. Boy, that really sounds like public safety to me, doesn't it? Confiscating firearms from ethnic minorities, even those individuals who immigrated from nations that Canada was not at war with, was common during the First and Second World Wars. World War II registered firearms were confiscated from Japanese Canadians early in 1940, long before Canada was at war with Japan. The RCMP's 1941 annual report emphasized that the Attorney General of British Columbia had refused to register any firearms owned by Orientals. Yeah, no racism here. William Lyon Mackenzie King, his Liberal government feared both fifth column activity among Canada's enemy ethnic communities, and more importantly, insurrection in Quebec over the conscription issue. On July 2nd, 1944, Montreal Mayor Camillien Aude publicly urges male Quebecers to refuse registering for mandatory military service. The following day, the federal government issues an order in council under authority of the Defence of Canada regulations requiring the registration of all rifles and shotguns. The conscience of Canada's elected officials and government bureaucrats is evidently not bothered by the fact that the gun controls introduced by the OIC are as restrictive as the gun control legislation existing in the fascist dictatorships that Canada is at war with. Not surprisingly, the RCMP, who often complains about the workload, administers long gun registration. A registration certificate issued under the 1940 OIC contains the name, address, and occupation of the owner, the purpose for which the firearm is owned, a description of the firearm, the racial origin of the owner, and whether or not the owner is a British subject. The registration certificate becomes in effect a de facto license to possess firearms. While many resident non-British immigrants present firearms for registration, the RCMP annual reports show that the majority of registration certificates that are issued to aliens go only to visiting American businessmen and hunters. It appears that most firearms submitted for registration by non-British immigrants are simply confiscated. Even though less than one-half of Canadian gun owners complied with this first attempt at universal gun registration, it continued until February 1945. Even the RCMP did not appear sorry to see it go. Hardly a good precedent considering the widespread support for the war effort. Like BC-68, long gun registration in World War II appears to have accomplished nothing but to foster widespread non-compliance while criminalizing a substantial portion of otherwise law-abiding population. There is no evidence presented in the RCMP's annual report suggesting that registration of either handguns or long guns had been used to solve crimes or that it did anything except divert resources from the war effort. Universal firearm registration would be rejected by successive Canadian governments and law enforcement agencies for the next 50 years. With this historical experience ignored just half a century after the entire concept has proven itself a failure, universal registration and gun owner licensing will be born again in Bill C-68. I will leave this for you to ponder. Is Canada a free and democratic society? We do not have to justify any of our property or what we purchase to anyone. This all of a sudden changes when it comes to firearms and the frequent argument against particular type of firearms is no one needs them. Well, I've just relayed to you an entire history that it's not generally the Canadian people that need to be limited. It is actually the government that needs to be limited. And if anybody thought that we were better than the Americans for not having such racist attitudes like they do, or did, well, our firearms control attempts over the past century and a half kind of dictate otherwise. Well, that's all I have to say for today. This is Mr. Kilroy on behalf of the Freedom Pages, wishing you a nice day.
There's an old saying, to the victors belong the spoils.
There's another old saying, Senator. Don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining.